Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're going on a journey to explore how the Quran was revealed and preserved over time. And get this, it was a process that took a whole 23 years.
Wow, 23 years.
Yeah, which is, pretty unique when you think about most religious texts, right? I mean, you
Right.
think of them kind of appearing all at once in one big boom. But with the Quran, it's this long, gradual unfolding. I'm curious, what's the wisdom behind that?
Hmm. That is a great question. I think to really get it, we need to step back and look at the world the Quran was revealed in. Think 7th century Arabia.
Hmm.
It was a very oral society. People relied heavily on memory and storytelling. So spreading the message over time, kind of bit by bit, made it much easier for folks to learn and remember it all.
Ah, so you're saying the Quran came down in a way that fit perfectly with how people lived and communicated back then.
Absolutely. If you think about it, it's like building a house. You wouldn't try to put it all up at once. You do it carefully, brick by brick, layer by layer. The Quran even says something similar in Surah 25, verse 32.
Oh, what does it say?
It says, "Thus it is that we may strengthen thereby your heart, and we have spaced it distinctly." Powerful, right? It's like a gentle rain nourishing the earth, as opposed to some huge, overwhelming flood.
I love that image. And I bet this gradual revelation was super important for the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the immense weight of receiving divine guidance over such a long period, the doubts, the challenges he must have faced.
Yeah, that had to be incredibly intense.
It was. And during that time, both he and the early Muslims were facing huge changes and upheaval. So the Quran coming down in stages acted as a source of comfort and strength, guiding them through uncertainty.
That makes so much sense. It's like having a wise friend offering support and direction exactly when you need it most. So it wasn't just about making the message easy to remember, but also about providing that comfort and guidance along the way.
Exactly. But the role of memorization can't be understated. In that oral society, accurately preserving the message was super important, and the way it was revealed made that possible.
Okay, that makes total sense. But if preserving the words was so important, why not just write them down? Could they even do that back then?
Oh, they could, and they did.
Yeah.
They actually had a two-pronged approach. They both memorized and he wrote it down. So companions of the prophet would memorize verses as soon as they were revealed, right on the spot. But they also had scribes meticulously writing everything down,
Scribes. Like who?
like a really famous one named Zaid ibn Thabit. And they used any materials they could find.
What kind of materials? Like scrolls?
Some of that, but also parchment, leather, even pieces of bone.
Bones. Seriously. That seems so fragile. Why go through all that trouble?
It shows just how much importance they placed on protecting every single word of the Quran. They knew this wasn't just any message, it was something precious, worth safeguarding for all future generations.
Mhm.
And this dual approach of both memorizing and writing ensured the Quran would survive and thrive, woven right into the fabric of their society.
That's incredible. So we've got this gradual revelation over 2 decades, meticulously preserved. But how did this actually affect the content of the Quran itself? I mean, did it address specific events as they happened, sort of in real time?
You hit the nail on the head. The Quran wasn't some static rule book handed down all at once. It was a living dialogue unfolding over time. So often, verses were revealed directly in response to things happening, questions people had, or challenges the early Muslims were facing.
Wow, so it's like the Quran was actively engaging with the world around it, offering solutions and guidance in real time. That's amazing. Do you have any examples of how that worked?
Absolutely. One that comes to mind is the prohibition of alcohol. The Quran didn't just ban it outright from day one.
It didn't.
Nope. The guidance unfolded over time, considering the social and cultural context of the time.
Ah, so it was more about gradual change rather than some sudden drastic rule. I like that. How did that prohibition actually play out?
Well, first, you have verses that acknowledge alcohol was a thing in society but warn about its downsides, like what you've seen in Surah 2, verse 219.
Okay, so just getting people to think about it.
Right, to consider the consequences. Then, in Surah 4, verse 43, they prohibit prayer while intoxicated. This ties into the sacredness of prayer and the need to approach it with a clear mind. Finally, a complete ban on alcohol is revealed in Surah 5, verses 90 and 91.
So it's like a step-by-step process, each stage building on the last one.
Exactly. And this gradual approach wasn't unique to alcohol either. You see it in other things too, like the change of Qibla, the direction Muslims face when they pray.
Right, right. You mentioned that earlier. First, they prayed toward Jerusalem, then later towards the Kaaba in Mecca. That seems like a pretty big shift. How does that fit into this idea of gradualism?
It's a great question. At first glance, it seems abrupt. But if you look closer, you see it was part of a bigger, more gradual story about the early Muslim community finding its own identity. Remember, they had just migrated from Mecca to Medina, building a new society from scratch.
So they were going through huge changes, trying to figure out their place in the world. And their prayer direction was evolving along with them.
Exactly. Initially, facing Jerusalem made sense. It recognized their shared history with other monotheistic faiths and helped them get settled in this new place. But as the Muslim community grew stronger and more distinct, they needed their own unique identity.
So facing Jerusalem wasn't really reflecting who they were anymore.
Right. They needed something more authentic to their own heritage. And that's where the Kaaba comes in.
The Kaaba.
Yeah. It was already a sacred spot in Arabia, even before Islam. So redirecting prayer towards it, as they were instructed to do in Surah 2, verse 144, allowed them to embrace a symbol that was truly their own.
It's like they were finally establishing their own space, their own unique spiritual identity. So even though the change itself seems sudden, it was actually part of a much longer, more gradual process.
Exactly. It's amazing to see how even these big changes in the Quran were often pieces of a larger unfolding story.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to ask. We've been talking about events from centuries ago. What does any of this have to do with us today?
That's the million-dollar question. How do we take these historical events and make them relevant to our lives now?
Right, that's what I'm wondering. We've uncovered all this amazing information, but how do we actually bridge that gap between then and now?
Well, that's a conversation for part 2 of our deep dive. But for now, I'll leave you with this thought. The fact that the Quran was revealed gradually in response to real-world events and challenges speaks to its timeless wisdom. Just as it provided guidance and solace to those early Muslims, it can offer the same to us today. That is, if we're willing to really engage with it deeply and thoughtfully. It really is amazing, A text from centuries ago still speaking to us today.
I know, but how do we actually apply those lessons to our modern lives? The gap between then and now seems huge.
You're not wrong. The world has changed a lot since the time of Prophet Muhammad. But think about it. The core human stuff, the challenges, the questions we wrestle with, those haven't really changed all that much. And that's where the Quran's timeless wisdom comes in.
Okay, I'm listening. How do we bridge that gap? Where do we even start?
I think one of the biggest takeaways from the Quran being revealed gradually is this: patience and perseverance.
Interesting. Are you saying that just like the Quran took time to be revealed, we need to be patient with ourselves and our own journey of understanding?
Exactly. We live in a world that's all about instant results. We want the quick fix, whether it's losing weight, learning something new, or even deepening our faith. But the Quran reminds us that real change, the meaningful kind, takes time.
It's like that saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. We can't expect to become experts overnight.
Precisely. It's a journey, not a destination. And it requires both patience and perseverance. There will be doubts, challenges, maybe even times you feel like giving up. But think about it. Prophet Muhammad faced tons of obstacles and trials during those 23 years of receiving revelation. We can draw strength from his example.
So we're not alone in our struggles. Even the prophet went through tough times.
Of course. He was human, just like us. He had his own moments of weakness, his own tests. But he never gave up, never lost faith. And neither should we. That's the beauty of how the Quran is revealed bit by bit. It reminds us that growth is a process. And it's okay to take your time, to stumble a bit, to question and learn along the way.
That's actually really comforting. Takes the pressure off. It's a good reminder that we don't have to have all the answers right away. And patience, perseverance, those are great qualities to have in any part of life, not just faith.
You're so right. They apply to everything. Relationships, your career, even just learning something new. And the Quran is full of stories of prophets and regular people who faced tough times with patience and perseverance and ultimately succeeded.
Speaking of stories, I'm curious about that idea of context you brought up earlier. How does that fit into understanding and applying the Quran's teachings?
That's a fantastic question, and it's super important for us to get this. Just like understanding the background of a verse helps us understand it better, we need to apply that same thinking to our own lives.
Okay, so you're saying it's not enough to just read the words on the page. We've got to think about the context those words were revealed in, and the context of our own lives.
Exactly. It's about asking yourself, what was going on when this verse was revealed? What challenges or questions led to this guidance? And how can I apply that wisdom to my own life today?
It's almost like having a conversation with the Quran, not just passively reading it.
I love that. And this whole idea of context is so important because it helps us avoid misinterpretations. Those misunderstandings that can happen when you take things out of context. It lets us appreciate the nuances of the Quran's message and apply it in a way that makes sense for us today.
Could you give me an example of that in action?
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's look at the verses about modesty and clothing. If we read them without any historical context, we might get a very rigid, literal understanding. But if we dig deeper, we see that these verses were revealed in a society where women were facing harassment and exploitation.
So it was about protecting women, their dignity and safety.
Exactly. The Quran was responding to a specific problem back then, offering guidance for that time and place. But we can't just copy and paste those rules into today's world, right?
Yeah.
We need to consider our own context, our own social norms, and then we apply those core principles, the modesty, the respect, the dignity, in a way that fits our lives.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like taking the essence of the teaching and translating it into our own language, our own culture. But that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of thought involved. It's not just following rules blindly, but really engaging with the text on a deeper level.
You're absolutely right. And that brings us to the third key takeaway from how the Quran was revealed, the importance of deep engagement.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What exactly does deep engagement look like? Is it just about reading and understanding the words?
It's way more than that. It's about approaching the Quran with humility, with a desire to connect with its message on a heart level and let it transform you. Remember all the effort those early Muslims put into memorizing and preserving every single word. They knew this wasn't just any book. It was divine revelation, a source of guidance.
Yeah, literally writing on bones. Talk about dedication.
Exactly. Their commitment inspires us to go beyond just reading. Engage with it on multiple levels. Memorize it, recite it, reflect on it, contemplate its meaning.
So it's not just about the head, it's about the heart too. Letting the Quran shape our character, guide our actions.
Beautifully put. It's about making the Quran a living part of your life, not just some book on a shelf.
This is all so inspiring, but honestly, it's a little overwhelming too. How do we even start? How do we cultivate that deep engagement in our crazy, busy lives?
That's a great question, and one I think a lot of us struggle with. And it's something we can definitely dive into in part 3 of our deep dive.
So last time, we were talking about how to bring those lessons from the Quran's gradual revelation into our lives. Patience, perseverance, understanding the context, both back then, A&D, in our lives now. But then you brought up this deep engagement. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of folks get stuck.
Yeah, it's easy to like the idea, but putting it into practice, that's a whole other thing, especially with how busy and distracting everything is these days.
Exactly. It feels like we're always bombarded with stuff, you know? So how do we even make space for the Quran, not just like physically opening the book, but really connecting with it mentally and emotionally?
Well, I think it starts with shifting our mindset a little. Engaging with the Quran isn't just another thing to check off our to-do list. It's about building a relationship, connecting with something sacred and powerful.
Okay, a relationship. I like that.
Yeah.
But relationships take work. You got to put in the effort. What are some practical things we can actually do to build that connection with the Quran?
One of the most powerful ways is through consistent recitation. Even if you only have a few minutes, reading the Quran out loud, it lets the words really sink in.
It's like you're letting the words wash over you, become part of you.
Exactly. And it doesn't need to be this huge chunk of time. Even 5–10 minutes a day can make a big difference. The key is consistency. Make it a habit, just like brushing your teeth or that first cup of coffee in the morning.
That's a good tip. Makes it seem a lot less intimidating. What about memorization? Some people find that really daunting, but we were talking earlier about how important it was for the early Muslims.
It is powerful. Memorizing helps you internalize the message, carry it with you. But you're right, it can seem overwhelming. The good news is you don't need to memorize the whole thing. Start small. Maybe a few verses that speak to you or a short chapter.
So it's like you're creating this mental library of verses that you can turn to anytime you need guidance or inspiration.
Exactly. And there's so many resources to help these days. Apps, online courses, study groups. You don't have to go it alone.
Awesome. So we've got recitation, memorization. What else can we do to really engage with the Quran on a deeper level?
Don't underestimate the power of reflection. It's not enough to just read or recite. We've got to pause, think about what it all means, and connect it to our own lives.
So asking yourself, what's this verse trying to teach me? How does it relate to what I'm going through right now? What wisdom can I take from it?
You got it. And journaling can really help with this. Write down your thoughts, your questions, anything that comes up. It's a way to process what you're reading and make it personal.
It's like having a conversation with the Quran, a back and forth where you're seeking guidance and wisdom.
Exactly. And another thing, don't be afraid to learn from those who know more than you. Go to lectures, join study circles, even just talk to a scholar or teacher you trust. That can open up so many new perspectives.
It's like joining this whole community of learners, all supporting each other on the journey.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, remember, engaging with the Quran isn't just about filling your head with knowledge. It's about transformation, letting its words purify your heart, make you a better person, and guide you towards a life with more meaning.
This has been incredible. We started with the history, how the Quran came down gradually, and now we have all these practical ways to connect with it in our own lives. It's given me a whole new perspective on this amazing text.
It's been a joy sharing this journey with you and all our listeners. And remember, this is a lifelong journey. You'll keep learning, growing, and discovering new things along the way.
Thank you so much for being on this deep dive with us. We hope you feel inspired to connect with the Quran in a way that brings meaning and transformation to your life. And until next time, keep diving.